Ladies and gentlemen, today we are gathered in a world that often seems unpredictable, uncertain, and even chaotic. Our lives are filled with moments of doubt, confusion, and despair, and the times we live in can leave us questioning the goodness of our world and the plans we think we have. But in the midst of all this, there is one truth that stands firm. God has a perfect plan, and even in the most imperfect times, that plan will not fail. The world may seem like it's falling apart, but God's sovereign will is still being carried out with precision, love, and grace. In fact, it is often in our moments of weakness, in the storms of life, that God's perfect plan becomes most evident. Today, I want to encourage you, to remind you that no matter how difficult the times may seem, God's plan for your life is always intact, always unfolding, and always leading you to His purpose. Through the Scriptures, we see time and time again how God worked His perfect plan through imperfect people in imperfect circumstances, from Joseph's time in the pit to David's time in hiding, from the Israelites' journey in the desert to the disciples' journey after the death of Jesus. God's plan never failed, and neither will it fail for us today. As we reflect on this truth, let's explore some key aspects of God's perfect plan in imperfect times, and let it renew our hearts with hope, peace, and confidence that God is still working in our lives. When we think of sovereignty, we are reminded of a ruler who is in complete control, whose authority is absolute, and whose decisions are final. But God's sovereignty is not merely a human concept of rule. His sovereignty encompasses everything, the entire universe, every life, every moment in time, every breath we take. Nothing is outside of His control. And when we talk about God's perfect plan, we must first acknowledge the truth of His sovereignty, because it is the foundation of everything else. In the book of Isaiah, God declares, "I am the Lord, and there is no other. Apart from me, there is no God. I will strengthen you, though you have not acknowledged me." Isaiah 45:9. This passage underscores the absolute authority of God, who is not subject to anything outside Himself. When we think about God's perfect plan in imperfect times, we must remember that God does not react to circumstances. He is the one who establishes them. He is not surprised by the trials we face, the pain we endure, or the challenges we encounter. Instead, He is working in and through these circumstances to bring about His perfect will. This is a difficult concept to grasp, especially when we are in the midst of hardship. It's easy to think that if God were truly sovereign, He would prevent all the pain, suffering, and chaos in the world. But we must remember that God's sovereignty is not about controlling every moment of our lives, but rather about using every moment, good or bad, joyful or painful, to fulfill His divine purposes. His plan is bigger than our momentary struggles. And even when things seem to be spiraling out of control, God remains sovereign. One of the most powerful examples of God's sovereignty can be found in the story of Joseph in the Old Testament. Joseph, the favored son of Jacob, was betrayed by his own brothers, sold into slavery, falsely accused of a crime, and thrown into prison. It would have been easy for Joseph to question God's plan for his life, to wonder where God was in the midst of his suffering. But in the end, Joseph understood something profound. After his rise to power in Egypt, he told his brothers, "You intended to harm me, but God intended it for good to accomplish what is now being done, the saving of many lives." Genesis 50:20. Joseph's story illustrates the truth that even in the most painful and difficult circumstances, God is still in control. He is using the broken pieces of our lives to bring about something far greater than we can see. Joseph's life was not perfect, but God has planned for. Joseph was, and his plan was always working even when Joseph couldn't understand it. God's sovereignty meant that He was using Joseph's betrayal, his years of suffering, and his rise to power to prepare him for a greater purpose. This doesn't mean that our pain is always easy to bear, or that we should ever minimize the hurt and struggles we face. What it means is that God, in His perfect sovereignty, is not limited by our circumstances. He is not shaken by the world's instability. He is not surprised by our imperfections or our failures. Instead, he uses all things, both the good and the bad, to bring about his perfect plan. Another example of God's sovereignty in action can be seen in the New Testament in the life of Jesus. Jesus' death on the cross is the ultimate illustration of God's sovereignty over all circumstances. The crucifixion was the result of the most unimaginable betrayal, the most unjust trial, and the most horrific punishment. But in the midst of this darkest moment in history, God was working his perfect plan. As the Apostle Peter declares in Acts 2:23, this man was handed over to you by God's deliberate plan and foreknowledge, and you, with the help of wicked men, put him to death by nailing him to the cross. Even in the face of such injustice, God's sovereignty was at work. Jesus' death was not a tragic accident. It was part of God's divine plan to bring salvation to the world. The cross, which seemed like a symbol of defeat, became the ultimate victory over sin and death. Through Jesus' sacrifice, God's perfect plan was accomplished. This is the beauty of God's sovereignty. He takes what seems to be the worst and uses it for the greatest good. It's a reminder that no matter how imperfect our circumstances may seem, God is still working in them. He is still in control. He is still on the throne, and his perfect plan is unfolding in ways we may not yet understand, but that doesn't make it any less perfect. As we reflect on this truth, we must ask ourselves, do we truly trust in God's sovereignty over our lives? Do we believe that even when things seem to be falling apart, God is still in control? Do we understand that God's perfect plan is bigger than our current struggle, and that he is working everything together for our good and his glory? When we recognize and embrace the sovereignty of God, we begin to see our circumstances through a different lens. We stop viewing our struggles as signs of abandonment or failure and begin to understand them as opportunity for God to show his power to shape us and to fulfill his perfect plan for our lives. In the end, it is God's sovereignty that gives us hope in imperfect times. When we trust in his absolute control over all circumstances, we can find peace, even in the midst of the storm, knowing that nothing is beyond his reach, and that he is using every moment, good or bad, to fulfill his perfect will in our lives. God, in the world, we often hear the phrase, perfection is the goal. In every area of life, whether it's work, relationships, or even our personal development, we're taught that perfection is the ideal. But what happens when we fall short of this ideal? What happens when we make mistakes, or our circumstances seem to be less than perfect? The good news is that God doesn't require perfection to accomplish his plan for our lives. In fact, he specializes in using imperfect people, broken situations, and flawed circumstances to bring about his will. We may look at our own lives and see our mistakes, shortcomings, and struggles, and we might believe that these imperfections disqualify us from being used by God. But the truth is, God's perfect plan is not dependent on our perfection. It's dependent on his power, his grace, and his love. The Bible is filled with stories of imperfect people whom God used in incredible ways. Take, for instance, the story of Moses. Moses was a man who had a history of imperfection. He was born in a time when his life was at risk. And he was raised in the house of Pharaoh, but grew up with a sense of identity as an Israelite. Moses made a fatal mistake when he killed an Egyptian taskmaster and had to flee Egypt, leaving behind the people he had hoped to deliver. For 40 years, Moses lived in the wilderness, a fugitive running from his past. Despite his imperfection, God had a perfect plan for Moses' life. God called him out of the wilderness, asking him to return to Egypt and deliver the Israelites from slavery. Moses was reluctant and full of self-doubt, asking God, "Who am I that I should go to Pharaoh and bring the Israelites out of Egypt?" Exodus 3:11. Moses believed that his past mistakes, his imperfections, disqualified him from being the one to lead God as people. But God reassured Moses that he would be with him and that he had a plan that would not be thwarted by Moses' imperfections. Moses, despite his insecurities and flaws, went on to be one of the greatest leaders in the history of Israel. Through Moses, God performed miracles, led his people out of Egypt, and gave them the law. The story of Moses teaches us that God does require us to be perfect for him to use us. Our imperfections, our mistakes, and our past failures are not obstacles. For God, they are opportunities for his grace to shine through. Another powerful example of God using imperfection to fulfill his plan is the story of David. David was a man after God's own heart, but he was far from perfect. As a young shepherd, David was overlooked by his family when the prophet Samuel came to anoint a new king. Even after David was anointed, he spent years in hiding, running from King Saul, who was jealous of him. And yet, David's most significant imperfection came when he sinned with Bathsheba and arranged for her husband, Uriah, to be killed in battle. David's sin was grave, and it seemed like it could have derailed God's plan for him. But God did not discard David because of his sin. Instead, God showed grace, forgave David, and allowed him to continue in the role he had appointed him to. David's story is a reminder that our imperfections don't disqualify us from God's plan. Even when we make mistakes, God is able to redeem and restore us. He is able to take our brokenness and use it for his glory. David went on to lead Israel and is remembered as one of the greatest kings in history. Despite his imperfections, God used him to establish a legacy that would eventually lead to the birth of Jesus, the King of Kings. God's use of imperfect people does not end with Moses or David. The New Testament is filled with examples of imperfect individuals whom God used to accomplish his perfect plan, the apostles. Paul, for example, was once a persecutor of Christians responsible for imprisoning and killing followers of Christ. He was an enemy of the very faith he would later spread. Yet, when God called him, Paul's past mistakes were not a hindrance to God's plan. God transformed Paul's life and used him to spread the gospel throughout the Roman Empire. God's plan is not hindered by our imperfections. Instead, he uses our imperfections as a platform to showcase his grace, power, and love. When we feel unworthy, inadequate, or imperfect, we must remember that God delights in using the weak and the broken to accomplish his purposes. He does not call the qualified, he qualifies the called. It is in our imperfection that his strength is made perfect. So when you look at your own life and see the areas where you fall short, remember this truth: your imperfections are not a hindrance to God's plan. In fact, they might be the very thing that God uses to bring about something beautiful. God is not looking for perfection. He is looking for hearts that are willing to be used by him. If we are willing to surrender our imperfections to him, he can use them to bring about his perfect plan in our lives. Faith is the cornerstone of our relationship with God. It is by faith that we believe in his promises, trust in his character, and follow his will for our lives. But what does it mean to have faith in God's perfect plan, especially when life is difficult and the future seems uncertain? Having faith in God's plan is not always easy. It requires us to trust that even when things are not going as we hope, God is still in control and that his plan is still unfolding. Faith is not about seeing the whole picture. It's about trusting that God sees what we cannot see, and that he is working all things together for good, even when we don't understand the details. The Bible tells us that without faith it is impossible to please God, Hebrews 11:6. Faith is essential to trusting God's perfect plan because it helps us navigate the uncertainties of life. It is by faith that we can rest in the assurance that God's plan is good, even when life is hard. Faith enables us to endure trials, hold on to hope, and believe that God's purpose will prevail no matter the circumstances. The Bible is full of examples of people who had to trust in God's plan by faith, even when they couldn't see the outcome. Abraham is one such example. God promised Abraham that he would be the father of many nations. Yet for years, Abraham and his wife Sarah had no children. They were well beyond the age of having children, and it seemed impossible. But God's promise was sure, and Abraham's faith never wavered. Despite the seeming impossibility of the situation, Abraham trusted God's plan. In Romans 4:20-21, it says, "Yet he did not waver through unbelief regarding the promise of God, but was strengthened in his faith and gave glory to God, being fully persuaded that God had power to do what he had promised." Abraham's faith was not in the circumstances, but in the God who had made the promise. He believed that God could bring his plan to fruition, even when everything around him suggested otherwise. And in the end, God fulfilled his promise to Abraham and Sarah. Through their faith, God's perfect plan was realized. Having faith in God's plan means trusting him even when we cannot see how things will work out. It means believing that God's ways are higher than our ways and that his timing is perfect even when we don't understand it. Faith requires surrender. It requires letting go of our own plans and trusting that God's plan is better. When we trust in God's perfect plan by faith, we can face the uncertainties of life with confidence. We may not always understand why things happen the way they do, but we can trust that God is faithful and his plan is always for our good. By faith, we can walk through life knowing that God is with us, leading us, and guiding us every step of the way. One of the most challenging aspects of trusting in God's perfect plan is the necessity of waiting. We live in a world that values speed and immediate gratification, where everything from food to instant messaging promotes the idea that we should have what we want when we want it, but God's ways are different. His timing is not bound by the constraints of our expectations or schedules. God's plan unfolds in his time, not ours. The Bible teaches us that there is a purpose in waiting. In Psalm 7:14, we read, "Wait for the Lord, be strong, and take heart and wait for the Lord." This passage encourages us to embrace patience, not passively, but with strength and courage. Waiting for God's timing is an active expression of trust in his sovereignty. It is a decision to acknowledge that God's perfect plan is far better than anything we could rush or force ourselves. The life of Abraham offers a powerful lesson in waiting for God's timing. God promised Abraham that he would be the father of many nations, but for many years, Abraham and his wife Sarah had no children. The promise seemed impossible, and as the years passed, doubt began to creep in. Sarah even took matters into her own hands and encouraged Abraham to have a child with her servant Hagar. But this was not part of God's perfect plan, and it led to complications and heartache. It was until Abraham was 100 years old and Sarah 90 that God fulfilled his promise with the birth of Isaac. Abraham's story reminds us that God's timing is perfect even when it feels like time is running out. His promises are not delayed, but are carefully timed for our good and his glory. Waiting on God's timing requires patience, but it also requires trust. We must trust that God knows what is best and that his plans are worth the wait. When we try to rush ahead of God or take matters into our own hands, we can miss out on his perfect blessings and purpose. In James 5:7-8, we are reminded, "Be patient, then brothers and sisters, until the Lord is coming. See how the farmer waits for the land to yield its valuable crop, patiently waiting for the autumn and spring rains. You too be patient and stand firm, because the Lord is coming is near." The farmer understands that there is a process: seed time, growth, and harvest, and each stage requires patience. Similarly, God's plan for us involves seasons of waiting. Just as a farmer waits for the right time to harvest, we must wait for God. Perfect timing to bring about the fulfillment of his plan in our lives. While waiting may feel like inactivity, it is in these seasons that God is working deeply within us. Waiting helps refine our character, builds our faith, and strengthens our dependence on him. The Apostle Paul writes in Romans 5:3-4 that we also glory in our suffering, because We know that suffering produces perseverance, character, and character, hope. The patience we cultivate in waiting for God, as timing produces a hope that does not disappoint. So, when you find yourself waiting for God to move in your life, remember that this is not a time of waste, but a time of growth. God is at work, even when we don't see immediate results. The promise will come in due time, and it will be worth the wait. Surrender is one of the most powerful acts of faith. It is the moment when we let go of our own plans, desires, and control and place them entirely in God's hands. Surrendering to God as will is not a sign of weakness, but of strength. It takes great courage to relinquish our own agendas and trust that God, as plan, is better than anything we could devise for ourselves. Throughout Scripture, we see the importance of surrender in God as plan. One of the most profound examples of surrender is the life of Jesus. In the Garden of Gethsemane, just before his crucifixion, Jesus faced the weight of the world as sin and the suffering he was about to endure. In his humanity, he prayed, "Father, if you are willing, take this cup from me. Yet not my will, but yours be done." Luke 20. Jesus surrendered to the Father. It was an act of obedience that led to the salvation of humanity. His surrender was not passive. It was a deliberate choice to follow God's perfect plan, even when it involved great personal sacrifice. Jesus' surrender shows us that following God's will isn't always easy. There are times when God's plan involves sacrifice, suffering, or stepping out of our comfort zone. But just as Jesus found peace and purpose in surrender, so too can we. Surrendering to God as will means acknowledging that we are not in control and that his plan is far greater than our own understanding. In Romans 12:1, Paul urges us to offer our bodies as a living sacrifice, holy and pleasing to God. This is your true and proper worship. Surrender is not a one-time event, but a continual act of offering our lives to God. It is a daily decision to say, "Not my will, but yours be done." Surrender is the key to walking in God as perfect plan, because it opens the door to his will in our lives. When we surrender, we align ourselves with his purpose, and he can work in and through us in ways we could never imagine. When we try to control our own lives and force our own plans, we often find ourselves frustrated and exhausted. But when we surrender, we open ourselves to the abundant life that God has promised. Surrender is not about giving up. It's about giving in to God's perfect will and trusting that he knows what is best for us. We live in a world that often values perfection above all else. We are taught to strive for flawlessness in everything we do, from our appearance to our achievements. But when it comes to God's plan for our lives, it's not our perfection that matters. It's our willingness to let God use us as we are. God takes our imperfections, our brokenness, and our weaknesses and uses them for his glory. The Bible is filled with stories of individuals who were far from perfect, yet God used them in mighty ways. One of the most powerful examples is the Apostle Paul. Paul, who was once a persecutor of Christians, became one of the greatest missionaries and church planters in history. He wasn't perfect. He struggled with his own shortcomings and weaknesses. In 2 Corinthians 12:9-10, Paul writes, "But he said to me, my grace is sufficient for you, for my power is made perfect in weakness. Therefore I will boast all the more gladly of my weaknesses, so that the power of Christ may rest upon me." Paul understood that it was not his strength or perfection that made him useful to God. It was his willingness to surrender and allow God to work through his imperfections. God's grace works through our weaknesses, demonstrating his power in ways that would not be possible if we relied solely on our own strength. God delights in using imperfect people. He doesn't need us to be flawless. He just needs us to be available. When we offer our imperfections to God, He is able to use them for His glory. Our weaknesses become opportunities for His power to shine. When we surrender our flaws, we allow God to turn them into something beautiful.